Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Earth Day Everyday podcast, where we aim to spotlight exemplary activists, policymakers, and changemakers in the field of sustainability and climate change. I'm your host, Aryan Doshi, and today we are so fortunate to be joined by Emma. Emma is a fellow at the Civic Action Program and is an intern at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Emma, it is absolutely wonderful to have you with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for letting me join on your podcast. I'm super excited to be here.
Thank you so much. I guess just first question is, as someone who's worked as an environmental science and policy graduate, you're interning at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy. Where did the story and journey really begin for you? And when did you know that this was a field you really wanted to pursue and have an impact in?
Yeah, great question. So to be honest, I didn't start in environmental science at all. When I finished my high school, I actually initially went into medical science. And as part of the medical science degree, I had to take a year in biology. And in one of my first biology courses is where I discovered ecology. And it took me a while to kind of realize that that's probably more what I was interested in. I kind of kept thinking about that ecology course as I kept going through chemistry and biology and all those kind of medical science
Yeah,
subjects, and realized like, oh, actually, I really want to know more about that. And so I think at the same time, COVID was happening, so
yeah,
it kind of again kind of made me, well, it gave me the time to pause and really think about what I wanted. So eventually I transitioned into a Bachelor of Science majoring in biodiversity conservation. That was my kind of first environmental science degree. And then, yeah, I think also kind of looking back on it now, it makes a lot of sense. I've always kind of had that interest in nature. I really like hiking and spending time outdoors. My dad was a gardener growing up, so I spent a lot of time outside. So I think it all kind of came to fruition
yeah,
in that sense. And I suppose the last thing I do remember thinking at the time, like, oh, well, like, if I don't do anything about climate change, like, what's the
yeah.
point of doing anything else? Like, we're not going to have a planet left. And I think looking back on it, that's kind of a little bit drastic, but that was definitely a thought that went through my mind. And kind of one of the kind of levers that ended me making that decision. And then I guess, yeah, at the same time, I've always had an interest in policy, and I've tried to kind of maintain that throughout my degree because I
Yeah,
think it's cool to be able to kind of connect the science and the research aspects with
absolutely.
how you can actually translate that into impact. So I've always tried to maintain a little bit of policy as I'm going through both my bachelor's degree and now
Yeah.
my master's degree.
Absolutely. And I think what you were saying there is sort of so true, right? When we think about environmental science, it is so interdisciplinary, like the way you were thinking about biology, chemistry, and policy, and then you came back to environmental science. I think that's one beauty in the field. But I know you were talking about policy there. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about the impact you see, and how it's so intertwined with the way we think about environmental science? Like maybe what is some impact you've seen with NGOs and organizations and what they're doing to advance climate policy.
Yeah, of course. I think I'll kind of step back a bit and talk about how the first kind of awakening I had in terms of how science can impact policy, and that came through one of my first initial roles at an organization called Science and Technology Australia, which is a peak body for STEM professionals in Australia. And their role is to kind of take the concerns of all STEM profession scientists, whether that's your chemists, biologists, marine biologists, all manner of STEM disciplines, and produce policy recommendations for people working in Parliament in Canberra. And yeah, I guess I hadn't really joined the dots in that process until I worked there and saw them practicing that at
Yeah,
a
yeah,
advocacy level. And so one of the great things that they worked on was this research commercialization bill, which passed, I think, in 2021, now 2022.
yeah,
And that's kind of to bridge the valley of death, is what they call it in the startup world, where there's a bit of a gap in that early to medium term funding for people who have no ideas and want to kind of expand it and commercialize it. So yeah, that was really cool to kind of see that materialize. And then as I've kind of, entered the early stages of my environmental science career, those kind of climate examples have kind of started to show up. So I know recently I just read an article in the Boston Globe where a a local school student from Andover managed to get EV chargers for their school. So
Yeah,
that's like very advocacy at a small level, but
yeah, for sure.
those kind of examples you can find across the country, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you were saying about taking it at a small level, I mean, that's sort of the mindset we have to have today, right? Starting off more in your local sort of community before thinking about global, right? Because if we have that mindset of just being one amongst the billions of people, then that sort of takes us astray from wanting to actually have a feasible impact. But just a little bit returning back to policy, I know we had talked about it, but sort of like maybe one of the main sort of, I guess, monumental legislations that, has been passed that countries have tried to follow is, first in the 1980s, 1990s, you had the Montreal Protocol that sort of tried to ban chlorofluorocarbons, and prevent the ozone hole. And it did sort of work in part because people were able to see and visualize the problem of the ozone layer, the ozone hole, and so they got it. And so that problem relatively has been solved in comparison to the climate problem we're dealing with today. But can you talk about the Paris Accords too? I mean, we've also seen it in 2015. And do you think we're meeting it? Do you think we're falling apart from it? And what do you sort of say to these ambitious goals countries are setting? I mean, do you think they're feasible or?
Yeah, that's a huge question. So I think the Montreal and the Kyoto Protocol to do with chlorofluorocarbons gets brought up a lot in environmental policy. Is kind of the gold standard of approach, especially when you're talking about such a large global level of policy. And I suppose one of the key differences in that it was ultra specific. It kind of gave really measurable, actionable recommendations for reducing chlorofluorocarbon
Yeah.
use. Such a long word to try and produce.
Yeah.
Um, and they also kind of gonna there was at the time scientific kind of appetite to create different materials that could be
Yeah.
substituted for those chlorofluorocarbons, and so that was kind of in part that led to the success. I think with the Paris Accords, it's a lot more complicated. Countries, rightfully so, have the ability to set their own national determined
Yeah.
contributions. So it's great that the flexibility exists, especially, every country has a different economic standpoint.
For
So we're not
sure.
on the same all on the same playing field. But it means there's a lot more variety in the avenues people can take. So it's a lot harder to kind of enforce and create measurable,
Absolutely.
actionable
Yeah.
targets. In terms of whether I think it's feasible, I think the bottom line is that net zero is feasible. We have like say a lot of different avenues you can go
For
through
sure.
if it's kind of more in the offsetting route, which is not the best and most sustainable option,
For sure.
or if it's going directly towards scaling back, like not permitting new oil and gas companies to set up
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
redirecting funds towards renewable energy. I think it's possible. I think the question is when we're going to reach that. We know that, you know, climate change is a pressing issue. Policy doesn't move at the same rate as
Yeah.
climate does. We're already seeing some record temperatures through the last summer, which is really scary to see. So there's definitely a question of when and a question of how well it's going to be kind of implemented. If it is going to be, kind of more the net zero route and it's not addressing the primary causes of
Yeah.
emissions.
For
So
sure. And I
that's
think this was something else that you had brought up as well, is that if we sort of want to see countries following through on their aspirations, there also has to be like this inter-country collaboration. I know this was something that you had sort of brought up as well, is that how do these sort of developed countries keep in mind their own ambitious targets and goals, net zero by 2050, 60, while also maybe trying to help other countries that don't have those resources? Because there's also sort of this fine line between the global north and south, who has access to resources and who doesn't, because the global north is the one primarily responsible for those emissions, and yet the global south is the one facing the brunt of it. And so how do you sort of foresee, I guess, this relationship panning out where not only should they be following through on their own goals, but also they have a duty to help other countries? How do they manage that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if this is the best example to give, but I know that a scenario that's playing out more close to home in Australia right now is the contentiousness of the South Pacific and the Pacific area at the moment,
Yeah,
through, a national security lens, which is really interesting to view climate as a national
absolutely.
security
Yeah,
issue. But I think that is also to the benefit of climate science, a lever that you can pull in the political world to actually achieve more activity in that space. So if we're wanting to build stronger relationships with our Pacific partners, even if that may be for a strategic military purpose,
Yeah.
you know, the biggest concern of a lot of these Pacific islands is climate change because it is so existential. You think about Tuvalu and it's 10
Yeah.
meters above sea level for most of
Yeah.
the island. So um, I think that is a possible route. Maybe it's not the best route, but it is an approach. And I think in this day and age, you have to consider all your different kind of options for leveraging policy. But it is a really difficult issue because you think about these global emitters like the US, Australia, UK, they do have their own internal challenges as well that they're facing,
Yeah.
not just, they have to make this really enormous transition and then help other countries. But at the moment,
Right.
you have the very slow global recovery of COVID and the housing crisis that is kind
Absolutely.
of front of mind of a lot of people going into elections.
Mhm.
And then you have everything that's kind of going overseas right now with Gaza and Ukraine. So it's a very tumultuous time. It's really hard to kind of keep climate on the agenda in this period. But I think a really important part to take out of it is considering your different options, even if it is through a national security lens or another kind of route is through kind of using corporate and business.
Yeah.
They can move at a lot faster rate than policy can. They don't have to rely on election cycles or passing through two chambers of government to be written into legislation. They can invest and create strategies. So I guess an example of that is there's this thing called the First Movers Coalition. Granted, I don't know a huge amount about them, but I recently read that Amazon is offering these kind of
Yeah.
long-term procurement contracts for
Yeah.
green shipping. And so if you're a green or if you're a shipping builder
For
and
sure.
you have kind of a long-term financing option for building zero emission vessels through companies like Amazon, then you're going to be more incentivized to build those ships and transition away
Absolutely.
from fossil fuels. So I think that gives you a little bit of hope. Even
Yeah.
if kind of we're not seeing action from our governments at the federal level, there is kind of those other avenues and levers that you can pull.
Absolutely. And I think the way you sort of talk about climate in context of other, I guess, geopolitical issues, I mean, it's important to also put it in that context, right? How do we sort of amplify its presence to sort of illustrate how sort of widespread the impact is? Because I know one thing just to sort of respond to that is with these sort of global warming temperatures, we also do see so many sort of individuals being displaced and having to move. And we sort of see like climate refugees, which that in itself, that is a bigger problem that hopefully we can get people to focus on that as an impact. But like you said, I think we definitely need to find a way to integrate it into the agenda so it's more closely sort of focused on. And I know something we've touched on just right now is policy, but it's all about advocacy. One avenue is through policy. Another avenue might be through writing and climate literacy. And so can you maybe talk about the work that you've maybe seen with that? How has writing sort of played a role in this agenda, both from maybe the people who are skeptical and the people who sort of are trying to push forward climate policy and agenda. But how do we sort of view this through the literacy aspect of it, and how can like anyone be a part of the literacy aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of climate literacy and creating that accessible environment, governments have a huge role in trying to reach those populations, especially marginalized populations. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of ways you can kind of think about this.
Yeah.
In America and actually a lot of places, there's often a rural-urban divide. Rural places don't are often
Mm.
not centers of power for government. You don't have government buildings. You don't have often people working in government buildings aren't from rural communities. Like sometimes there are, but sometimes that representation
Yeah.
isn't sufficient. And so government does have like kind of a bigger role, or even not-for-profit agencies in those areas
For
having
sure.
a greater connection and interface with government um, can kind of lead to new opportunities to increase climate literacy and see how people can be involved and where kind of climate action is going at
Yeah.
a policy level.
Sure.
Another kind of thing that I've seen recently in my internship is language access.
Yeah.
So the US is a really diverse place, and that's really awesome. We have so many vibrant communities from all
Yeah.
across, a lot of South American communities, and the government also has a responsibility in making sure that their actions and what they're kind of producing, whether that's, white papers or updates on what their climate plans are, making
Yeah,
sure that those are accessible in multiple
absolutely.
languages online and in-person kind of town meetings and stuff. So all all of the rich diversity of Americans can get
Yeah,
involved in that process. So I think there's kind of two accessibility aspects of increasing climate literacy, which there is a renewed focus on, but I think sometimes get overlooked. And then in terms of, we all kind of probably know someone who isn't focusing on climate
yeah,
as their kind of first priority, or they have their doubts. And I think kind of the best approach that I've kind of learned from listening to others is that
mhm,
it's a really respectful way about, maybe engaging in those
mhm.
controversial conversations is to be curious.
For
Don't
sure.
be
Yeah,
openly judgmental. I think curiosity kind of can lead you down more richer conversations and uncover some values statements that
yeah, absolutely.
possibly are underlying those opinions about climate. And I think if you can kind of talk to or address those, you may be able to have more productive conversations
Mhm,
around
mhm.
climate. And then the last thing I would say is that I think sometimes we need to give some people grace. Just thinking about it, a lot of people whose first priority is probably never going to be climate in their lifetime because of the increasing challenges we're
Yeah,
facing today with the housing crisis, with immigration, or maintaining your visa status, or caring for a
yeah,
family member. And I think that's entirely valid. So not being too like, I
absolutely.
think it's great that environmental scientists, we do have this enthusiasm and sense of urgency that we want to take action.
Absolutely.
But I think if we want kind of sustainable support and to not push people away and kind of give ourselves a bad name,
Yeah.
bad rap, that we also have to have grace for those kind of people as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a important opinion to have in mind, especially when you're sort of trying to create a movement, right? There has to be this sense of empathy that like I see where you're coming from. I know it might not be the most important sort of issue in your mind, but that's okay. And let me sort of maybe give you an alternative to how we can potentially sort of involve you. I think that's so important. And one sort of question, just to go back, I know in the beginning you were talking about how when you were entering the field of environmental science, like through ecology, biology, chemistry, sort of merge into one. And how you sort of had this mindset of like, ultimately at the end of the day, it's all about the planet. And I think when people are coming into the field with that sort of view, sometimes it's overwhelming. And maybe this is sort of a viewpoint that the skeptics have as well, that like, okay, maybe I do recycle this piece of trash. Maybe I do bring a reusable cup. Maybe I am reducing my carbon footprint, but I'm one of the billions. And right now we're in the 2000s. Probably when we get to, I don't know, 2050, 60, population will reach 10 billion. And so there's this sense that how can such a small sort of person in the view of such a large world have any impact? And so there's this sense of how will I among the billions have any difference? And I think that's sort of an important question to also address to maybe quell those doubters and invite them into this movement. But what message do we say to them and how do we get them to join us and be on board with us?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I think it kind of relates back to what we just talked about having grace not only for other people, but
Mm,
having a little bit of grace towards ourselves. So I've been reading this book recently by Oliver Berkman called 4,000 Weeks, Time
yeah,
Management for Mortals. Great book, highly recommend. It kind of, if you're the type of person that feels like they have to like get so much done in their limited
yeah,
time on earth, like they have to experience everything, try all the foods, have that kind of constant pressure
yeah,
to be as efficient and productive as possible, I recommend this book. This kind of lets you take a step back.
yeah, yeah,
But something that he kind of talks about is that within all those pressures, there's also this pressure that we have to live a meaningful life and make a difference. Um, and the hard reality is that most of us, including myself, are probably not going to have that world changing effect that we think we ought to have.
absolutely. Yeah,
And I think um, the kind of thinking around that is like, okay, if it's not going to be this global scale change, like what is in control and what is actually meaningful and attainable in my life. So that's where it comes kind of back down to that local level action. I think there
absolutely.
is
Yeah,
absolutely value in kind of those individual actions. So I think as an example of something I kind of drummed up when I was thinking of kind of
yeah,
responses to your questions is, what if you simply ask yourself, oh, why doesn't my council area do food waste collection? I know that my friend in like a different state does.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's happening there? And then kind of thinking about, okay, well, if it's not happening in my state, can I talk to my local council member about it? Or can I see if my neighbors have kind of
Yeah,
interest in getting
absolutely.
this for our neighborhood? And then if you think about if there's 20 people in every state across
Yeah,
America kind of had that
absolutely.
conversation in
Valid.
question and
Yeah.
then pursued action about it, you may not see the big difference like yourself, but there
Yeah.
will be kind of a change happening like across the country if
Possible.
that was
Yeah.
the case, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there is to kind of keep that momentum going, I think you have to be rational, have reasonable expectations for yourself.
Yeah.
Like you probably like say the world change is
For
going to be
sure.
really hard. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of people. There's only so much you as an individual can
Can
do,
do. Yeah.
but that doesn't mean you can't do nothing. And ultimately, like say, we do only have one planet, so we only have kind of one option, one way to think about this. So but yeah, I think again, having grace for yourself as well. Like, you know, we can all pursue every greatest climate action,
Yeah.
everything that like constantly in our life, you know, like changing all the light bulbs, more energy efficient. Like there's sometimes only some things within our control. And I think that's fundamentally okay too. And it's okay to promote that message.
Yeah, and I think what you described also when you were talking about like if 20 people across all the states do that too, right? Then you sort of are able to scale it. You might not be able to witness that scale, but starting off small and maybe sort of spreading the message, whether it be through social media platforms, friends, I mean, you'll never be able to see the sort of sequence of steps. You taught it to one person, they taught it to another, and you sort of see that sort of interconnectedness. You won't be able to see that, but I guess there's also this sense of trust and innate sense of wanting to help and believing in the issue that motivates you to act in the first place. And I think one sort of issue today that people approach when looking at the climate problem is that, in many parts of the world, they have this mindset that I'm not experiencing the most extreme weather. I have direct access to water, to nature, in the environment that I'm in. And so they sort of have this restrictive sort of view and lack the globalist mindset about what other people are experiencing. And I sort of like to refer to this as, people of today and right now is that people in their own current situations, they might be at that present moment in time, they might have this mindset and feeling that I'm not experiencing the most extreme weather, the most extreme change. And to all the climate activists out there, I don't understand what you're sort of fighting for or what your objective is because I'm not seeing the physical impacts of what you're advocating for. But in reality, there might be maybe that farmer who's heavily relying on the rain, on the weather for the crops. And those crops indirectly are what support you and what sustain you, not only yourself, but your family, your friends too. So it does have an indirect impact, but it's hard to sort of get people to see that impact. And so, how do we address this mindset of the people of today and right now, and maybe how do we sort of change the narrative and allow people to have that globalist sort of view and thinking?
That's a really great question and very well articulated. I think I think there's a lot of learning that could come from listening to different people and kind of like I don't want to sound cliche, but like broadening your horizons by like engaging in
Absolutely.
different opportunities when you travel
Yeah,
or when someone new comes to your school.
for
Like
sure,
I
for
think
sure.
there's a lot of different I think there's a lot of different opportunities to learn from diverse people and therefore kind of understand and get a kind of a sense of diverse issues. But I can, yeah, it's interesting. I almost feel that I don't know. There's that sense of indirectness, and I've
Yeah,
also witnessed kind of also a shifting baseline syndrome, like
yeah,
where people's like, oh well, like it's fine for me right here, right now.
for
But if
sure.
they kind
Yeah,
of look
yeah,
back through time, like actually the environment that I live in currently is completely different to what it was like 100 years ago. It
absolutely.
was
Yeah,
10 degrees cooler and we had different trees in our neighborhood
yeah, yeah,
if you
absolutely.
thought to look that far. So I think that is a kind of an ongoing challenge. I think education and kind of having
for sure.
climate as part of the curriculum is a really big part of it, and I think that's been done a lot better now. Actually, like growing up, I don't really remember actually talking about climate change a whole lot in my primary school, whereas I think it is kind of more standardized now,
Yeah,
and I think that's awesome, and it gets, the younger generation talking about it and curious about it. But yeah, yeah, it is definitely kind of an ongoing
yeah,
problem, I think. I don't think I have a straight answer to that.
yeah.
But it has made me, I know this is not directly relevant, but it makes me think about kind of where I'm living right now in Boston.
Mm,
I'm actually pretty new to the area. I've only been
yeah.
here not even a year. um, and it's been really like I one of the things I was super excited about when I moved here was snow. We don't have a lot of snow back home in
Yeah,
Australia. I was like, I just really
same,
want to
same
see
in
like a
California.
big
Yeah,
snowstorm,
yeah.
right? And I kind of found out a little bit to my disappointment that it hasn't really been snowing a lot the last couple of years. Like
Yeah,
and I listened to people who've grown up here all their life and they're like, oh yeah, like when I was younger, we used to get snowed in, you know what I mean? There
yeah,
was
yeah.
so much, snow, so many big
Absolutely.
snowstorms and snow days. And I think last year we basically had one snowstorm and it
Oh
was
my
still
God.
pretty little.
Yeah,
So just even seeing that impact and then having kind of that recognition from, the people I know and their parents who have lived here, seeing like
yeah,
actually being actually really able to see that with their eyes that climate change is happening. So I think that gives me a bit of hope because that's
for
really
sure.
wide
Yeah.
scale and that like impacts a lot of people. But yeah, just
Yeah, and
that.
I think what you said also about talking with the people who had lived in Boston, maybe people who were older and sort of had been in the area for a while. I think there's also this sense of how do we sort of create the climate sort of conversation to be intergenerational? Because a lot of people they sort of think that okay, the burden is on young people and elder people, they don't really care about the issue as much. But like you just said, right, they can provide a valuable sort of outlet and source that we had been experiencing so much snow when we were younger, but now look at where we've gone. And then that mindset, when sort of spread and sort of passed down from person to person, that can have an impact on the young person and cause them to view the issue in a more significant, serious lens. So there's also that sense of intergenerational between the youth and the elderly people that I think is so important to have. Maybe just one or two more questions here is I mean, what do you sort of say to the aspiring environmentalists today? I mean, you've been able to have such a meaningful impact in the field. And I think you also talked about having that sense of grace as well, that you don't need to think about altering the world, right? But just start off local, start off small. But what do you sort of say to the aspiring environmentalist? I mean, the field is definitely expanding, like you said. We're seeing it more sort of spread out through education platforms around the world. But there are doubters. There are people who come into the field thinking about more cost and money oriented rather than sort of being focused on what can we do for our earth and create a sustainable sort of future. So there's so many different mindsets, perspectives being thrown at you. You don't know where to start. How can they maybe have an impact that you're having today? And what do you sort of say to them so that they can get there and reach that stage?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I will say I'm definitely still in the baby steps of my career. I've just got a long way to go. I'm hoping that I will make a lot more impact than I have to date. Um, and yeah, I will also start off by saying that I really didn't know environmental science at all until I went to college, and I think that should change. Hopefully, I think it will change. So I'm not too concerned about that. But I would say that there's a lot of possibilities, and I don't think people realize that when they first go into the field. I know that
Yeah.
my parents were a little bit like, "Oh, so what are you doing again? What's environmental science?" So
Yeah.
I'll try and put some context around that. So maybe that will like help people visualize what you can actually
Yeah.
do with the
Absolutely.
degree. So, in terms of different careers that I've seen, and that some of them that I've been a part of, are lucky to be a part of. So, first is the policy area, which we've been talking
Yeah.
about a lot today. And so there's two kind of directions in that. The first is working for government at the local, state, federal level, and this is not all of the government's work, but a lot of it is regulation and enforcement of environmental
Absolutely.
policy. So if you think about the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, and kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
making sure that companies and municipalities are being responsible and taking the right actions to make sure our resources are safe.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But then some of it more is more action based. So thinking the Department of conservation and recreation in Massachusetts. They get kind of large scale grants from federal agencies usually, and they're
Mm.
responsible for taking care of. I think they have like 1/3 of Massachusetts lands or
Wow.
something like that. They have a lot
Yeah.
of land under their
Yeah.
provision, and they're kind of making sure that um, our parks and recreation areas are
Absolutely. Yeah.
accessible and that they're climate resilient. So there's kind of lots of lots of different roles in government, but they're kind
Yeah.
of some of the main ones. And then the other avenue in the policy realm is the politics side. So working for a
Absolutely.
local representative or being a representative yourself. So that's more around community engagement, listening to constituents and what their concerns are, and then also helping drafting new policy recommendations. I will just kind of throw in a bit of a fact here. I learned recently that Massachusetts gets 8,000 new pieces of legislation kind of thrown into their policy
Wow. Oh
cycle
my
every
God.
year. So
Wow.
there's always a
That's
lot of action in that space.
wow.
We don't probably always see it or always
Yeah.
engaged in it, but there are things happening at the state, local, federal level. So it's really yeah, I'll try not to put too much of a pressure on people to get involved in politics, but it is really interesting, and there is things being done, even though it may not seem obvious. The second kind of route that people kind of I think maybe associate environmental science
Yeah.
more with is the NGO advocacy kind of lens
Sure.
and pushing for change, whether it's advocating for underrepresented groups.
Yeah.
Geez, struggling with my words. And like through that kind of climate and environmental justice lens,
For
which I
sure.
think is hugely important on kind of several issues, are like pushing forward a new policy recommendation.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that there's other things that NGOs like do. There's tons. You can pick an NGO for anything, whether that's
Yeah.
replanting or growing the clean energy workforce. And then you have kind of the corporate side. A lot of environmental scientists go into consulting. So whether that's
For
helping
sure.
businesses
Yeah.
make their practices more sustainable, or again, it's project based and they're getting funding from different agencies to implement
Absolutely. Yeah.
projects from, uh, green stormwater to
Yeah.
coastal restoration, lots of different kind of
Yeah.
projects
Yeah.
depending on where you live. And then you have the research side of things. So again, kind of at the frontier, novel side of environmental science, looking at how climate may have different impacts on different
Absolutely.
people,
Yeah.
different health conditions, or on different animals. And then hopefully kind of connecting that kind of research to policy and policymakers and making sure that's kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
reflected there. So
Absolutely.
there's a whole swath of careers in environmental
Yeah.
science. Definitely encourage people to take up the discipline, the career path. I will say that two things that have definitely helped me along my kind of route so far. One is volunteering. I know that not everyone has the time or feel like they
Yeah.
have the time for volunteering, but even if it's just trying to do something that you enjoy, not
Yeah.
necessarily to
For
build
sure.
your resume or like with that focus, I think you never know what kind of opportunities can kind of turn out from that,
Absolutely.
or at the
Yeah.
very least, it's something that you enjoy that's maybe
Yeah.
out of your periphery, I guess. So for me at the moment, I volunteered at the Fenway Victory Gardens because I enjoy
Wow.
gardening basically, and
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
have a
For
garden at
sure.
my current apartment. So that's kind of social enjoyment. But also through that, I've met people that work at organizations that I'm interested in
Wow.
working for in
Yeah.
future. So you never know what kind of will turn out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then kind of related to that piece is networking, which people kind of harp on about, and it's kind of sometimes hard to visualize what that looks like.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit hard to explain as well, but I think it's just really being keeping open-minded when you're out in school, you're going to a school
Yeah.
event, you're going to a career expo, or even if you're just like getting different
Yeah.
presentations and speakers kind of delivered to you throughout the course of your life, and just really following up with anyone that you were truly engaged with, um, or making cold calls out or cold emails out to
Absolutely.
organizations that
Yeah.
you're interested in learning more about. I think that's hugely valuable. And one last thing I would say on that is don't like keep it narrowed to the environmental science field. I
Yeah.
think sustainability is becoming business as usual.
Yeah.
And so having, a diverse people that you can call upon for when you're thinking about, possible solution to a challenge, it's really
Yeah.
cool to have people from people who have expertise beyond your own discipline. So
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Emma, for all your advice and really sort of the takeaway that start off small. I think you might not always know what your vision, what your career will look like, but it's just the small things, starting off local. Like you said, doing what you love, right? Maybe it's gardening, maybe it's being outside and really interacting with people, and really going from there. I think you might not always see the impact you're going to have, but it's also about trusting in your belief and trusting in what you do. So thank you
Yeah.
so much for all your words of wisdom, all your words of advice, and taking the time to join us. Thank you so much to our viewers as well. And we'll see you all on the next episode of Earth Day Every Day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed this discussion. This was great.
Thank you so much.